Welcome to the sew along for the Wyman Dress Sloper. The Wyman Dress Sloper is a little bit different than our usual patterns because it's designed to make a fitting sloper that you can fit to your body and then use to either hack into different styles or use your sloper pieces to help fit other patterns. For that reason, it's constructed a little bit differently than usual, and I'll take you through that today. So in order to make your Wyman sloper, you need a few things. First up, muslin or calico, or a similar mid-weight woven fabric. Then you need a zipper. It needs to be at least 24 inches. Longer is actually fine, it's not a problem, but at least 24 inches. And we recommend the easiest thing to use is a regular zipper, and by that I mean not an invisible one, but you can also use an invisible one if that's the only thing you have. It doesn't really matter, and obviously because it's just a sloper, you don't need to worry about what color it is. So that's everything that's involved in the materials of the actual sloper. In order to mark, and you're going to see we're going to mark in a different way than usual, I recommend choosing between a couple of different things. The first thing is a Sharpie is very, very helpful because it goes through your muslin and allows the sew lines that we're going to mark, which is very different to a usual pattern. We don't usually mark sew lines. It allows it to be seen on both sides. So regardless of how you mark the pattern, I recommend having a Sharpie as part of this. So basically just a felt tip pen that is fairly kind of strong and goes through the fabric. Then for marking the sew lines and the balance lines and everything else, I do recommend at this point having one of these marking tools. So it's basically just got this like relatively blunt serrated edge. And then you have these sheets of paper. They are either like wax or carbon paper, and I'll show you in a minute how you use them. You don't have to have this. I will go on to show you like different approaches and they work a little bit differently, but it's certainly a useful way to do it. Also, when you're marking, it's helpful, but not absolutely mandatory to have a French curve, so a curved ruler and a regular ruler. It will just help you get the lines a little bit straighter. So let's take a look at the pattern pieces. So we have a darted bodice on the front and the back, and immediately you can see this is a little bit different than a usual cashmerette pattern because there are two lines. There is a cut line, which is the darker one, and a sew line for every size, which is the lighter one. I highly recommend printing your pattern in layers, using only the layers you need, because when all the layers are there, it's a little bit confusing. But as you can see, once you've only printed one size or a couple of sizes, it's much easier. We also have the bust balance line here that goes from the apex towards the seta front, and we're going to want to mark that on our pattern piece. Next up, we have the back bodice. We also have the balance line here. We've got a dart, fairly straightforward. There are then two sleeve options. So the first sleeve option is a two-piece sleeve. So you can see it here. It's got an outer sleeve and an inner sleeve. So this is a great option, especially if you have fuller arms and you're going to later be making adjustments, because it gives you a little bit more of a wiggle room and it allows you to get a nice curve. But ultimately it's personal preference. So there's a two-part sleeve here if you wish to do that. Or we have a one-piece sleeve, which you can see here, which includes an elbow dart, which is going to help us get a nice curved sleeve, which follows the curve of your arm. And then for the skirt, we have a fairly standard straight skirt pattern. We have a front and a back piece. There is the hip balance line here we're going to mark on. The waist you don't need to mark because you sewed it, so you'll be able to see it, with a front and a back dart. So the first thing you need to do is cut and mark your pattern pieces. Cutting them, fairly normal, what you normally do, use the outer cut line. But marking is where we're going to do something a little bit differently than we usually do on our patterns. So you're going to mark the pieces on the right side of your pattern first. And then, depending on how the marking goes, we may remark them, because what we want is for these lines to show on the inside and the outside of our muslin. So the first way I'm going to show you is by using wax or carbon paper and these little rotary marking tools that you can get. So it's a serrated marking tool. So unfortunately, these pieces are a little bit small, but I'm going to have to move them around. I'm going to start here. So this is the right side. I just want to make sure that I'm going to line this up correctly. Okay, And then I'm going to take my pattern piece. I'm going to align the center front, which as it happens, there's a fold there. And this is something you really need to do accurately. So I've placed the pattern piece on top now, and I'm just going to secure it down a bit with some washers because these things tend to slide down. So any kind of pattern weight is fine. And then just going to recheck it's perfectly aligned. Yeah. I'm just going to press through with my wheel along the sew lines. I'm just going to double check that it worked. Ah, perfect. This is a technique you can actually use for any kind of sewing and marking. So if you want to transfer darts, it's very accurate, I'd say, is the biggest benefit. And for this purpose, very nice. So I'm going to mark the notches too. So I'm just going to mark across there. Okay, now I'm going to have to slide the paper because my pieces aren't big enough. Okay, I'm going to carry on. If you want, for things like the darts, which are totally straight line, you can use a ruler to help you get them precisely straight. Okay, so let's see how this went. Beautiful. So you can see that very accurately laid out there. Now it's important you can see on the front and the back, and look, you can't see on the back here. So in this case, what I'm going to do is go over the lines with a Sharpie. And what you will see, assuming it works as it's meant to, is that the ink does show through to the other side. So there you go. So you want to now do this. So if when you do your tracing, it doesn't come through, I then need you to do that. Now, an alternative way to mark, and this is a bit more destructive, so it depends a little bit on what you want to do, but it's to cut the seam allowance off this and use it like that. So I'm going to show you now. So I'd say if you have that marking tool, it's a bit better. The other thing you can do is you can just use a ruler and measure in by an inch, but the problem with that is that, especially going around curves, it's not ideal. You can do it, and you will see me later like truing curves sometimes with a straight ruler, but this is really better. There is another marking tool, there's one from Clover, that's like this, but it's 2 wheels, and you can set them however far apart you want and basically use that to add seam allowance. So that is another approach that you can take, but you would still have to use the carbon or wax paper because it doesn't actually mark the fabric, it just sort of perforates it. So this is the slightly more destructive route, as you can see, but it works too. Now, because I'm going to be using a Sharpie and it shows through on both sides, I'm actually going to flip this over to mark it because it's going to make it easier to see it face up. So this time I'm going to align it in the middle, and here's the crucial thing. I have to make sure that it is 1 inch from the top and bottom so that it is in the right place. So that appears to be correct. Yes. Okay, so it's aligned with the center front. So this time for the outside, I'm just going to draw it straight in Sharpie. What's nice is that the edge of, oops, not the best at this. The edge of the paper gives you kind of something to keep the pen against, although as you can see, you still have to be careful to get it right. Okay, marking the notch there. Okay, just going to mark top and the bottom here. Now, for marking the balance line and marking the darts, there's a couple of options. For the balance line, the easiest thing is to take a pin, put it through the end of the balance line, carefully flip your piece up, make a note of where that is, and then just use the ruler to join them up. For the darts, you can do the same thing. So you can mark the bottom of the darts here, put a pin in the end, fold it over and mark it. For the darts, what matters is the sew line, but you can certainly go all the way up to the cut line there. Or there is another alternative for marking darts, which, you know, we've already been a little destructive with our pattern, so we can be a little more destructive, is that you can cut the dart out. So there's two options here. You can cut one side, and then you can fold up the other side like this and mark it in, and then you can always, so you fold it up and you can always flap it down, or you can actually just cut the whole thing out. So in this case, I've cut it out. So I just want to realign everything. And draw these on. Okay, so what I'm just going to do now is draw over the markings on that side to give myself a total marked piece. Okay, so here is my fully marked front. I use different techniques on both sides, but end up with what I need. Now, just one point here. We refer to this as the sew line because ultimately when it's all put together, this is where the seams will be. But when you sew a seam, you will have to sew across the whole thing. So for instance, in the shoulder, you won't just sew from here to here, you will sew across the whole edge. Now, if it's easy for you on your sewing machine to sew a 1-inch seam allowance, and what I will say is if your machine doesn't have a line for a 1-inch seam allowance, put some tape on it, like measure on your machine and put some tape to help you so you can do that. But if you want more help beyond that, it's actually really simple. You can just, when you mark your pattern, mark across the top. So if you need a bit more help, you can do that. And you can do that at any point. So you just extend by the 1-inch at these points. So not everyone needs to do that, but if that's something that's going to help you when you're sewing, go ahead and do it. So now that this piece is marked, I'm going to go ahead, cut and mark all my other pieces, and then we'll be ready for some sewing. So for the sloper, we're going to be sewing at a 4.5 to 5 stitch length because we want to be able to take it apart very easily as we are trying it on and making changes in the end. So that also means don't backstitch. We don't need to backstitch at all. And when you're doing things like darts, you don't need to worry about tying them off at the end. Again, you want them to kind of stay in place, but you're not going to be wearing this in the long term, so you don't need to worry too much about that. So the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to sew along the sew line of the neckline. It's a little hard to see this because we obviously already drew the black lines on, but I have sewn at a 5 stitch length all the way around the edge here, all the way up to the edge of the seam allowance. So I've done that on the front. And then I have done the same on the back. In each case, you want to start at the shoulder and go towards the center. And on the front, you do it in 2 passes, going from the shoulder to the center, shoulder to the center. So that's the first step. So now you are going to sew the darts. So there are 4 darts in the front piece. There are 2 darts on the back bodice. There are 2 darts on the front skirt, and there are 2 darts on the back skirt. So They're all sewn in the same way. You're probably familiar with how to sew darts. So I am going to just pin my dart first. Now, when you are doing this kind of pinning, you want to make sure the most important thing is that it's meeting at the sew lines. And this is where it is helpful to be able to see the markings on both sides. So then I'm gonna pin through to the end. So now that's pinned, I am going to sew it, starting at the outer edge, going straight to the end of the dart, off the end by a few inches. Don't need to tie it off or anything, just leave it there. I will then sew all the other darts in the various pattern pieces. For the bust darts, we're going to press it down. For the waist darts and the bodice, we're going to press them towards the center. Then on the skirt, we're going to press the darts towards the side seams just to avoid the bulk in the waistband when these two things go together. So the darts will be pressed in opposite directions. So here is our front bodice. The darts are all sewn, bust darts are down, waist darts are in. And the darts are on the wrong side, and this will be the right side. Now, one thing I forgot to mention earlier is we also need to mark the center front and center, well, actually only the center front because the center back has a seam on it. So here I can actually see the center front quite easily. So I'm just going to mark it in, but you should do that before you sew the darts. So the next thing we're going to do is sew the front bodice to the front skirt. Here is my front skirt. The only thing I've done is sew those darts and press them to the center, and the center front was already marked here. So this is right side up. I'm going to put my bodice right side down, so right sides together, and then pin them together. Again, the crucial thing is that they align at the sew line. So I am going to pin at the sew line and make sure they match up there. Get this corner right. And then the dart should match up here. And just continue pinning through. And this is where you really see the benefit of using the Sharpie to mark the sew lines, because you can actually see them straight through there. And when you have darts that are going in opposite directions, it's helpful to actually put pins through the dart uptake to kind of hold them going in the right direction as you sew, because otherwise they have a tendency to flip. Okay, so that's pinned. Now I'm going to sew the top to the bottom all the way across, again starting at the edge here. Add a bit extra if you need guidance for where to start, but sew it all the way across. And then we're going to be pressing the seam allowance down towards the skirt. And here is the front, which is now sewn in its entirety. So we are constructing it like this a little bit differently than you normally would construct a dress to really maximize our ability to tweak it when you are doing fittings. So the next step is to repeat the same process, but using the back, which is split into two. So I'll just start on the one side for now. So here's the back left skirt, back left bodice. I'm going to flip it over and pin it. Matching up the dart, matching up the edge, making sure those sew lines are matching nicely. And the same over here. There we go. So I'm going to sew from here to here on both sides, and again press the seam allowance down. Okay, so here are the two backs. This is the right side, this is the wrong side. The seam allowances are pressed down. So the next thing we're going to do, again pretty different than a normal garment, is we are going to sew the center back seam all the way down. So I'm going to bring it round because it's a little easier to see. Place them right sides together. And I'm going to pin along the whole back. So we are doing a different method of inserting a back zip than we usually do for Cashmerette. The main reason we're doing this, first of all, it's kind of quick and easy. Second of all, it's the easiest way to install a very accurate zip at the 1-inch seam allowance. The 1-inch seam allowance, you know, makes some things a little bit harder from a sewing perspective, even though from a fitting perspective, it will be better. And so this, as we were developing the sloper, we realized is the best way to do it. When you get to the seam allowances, make sure they're both down, and then I put a pin through the seam allowances so that they don't end up going the other way. I'll go to the end of the skirt and work my way back up. Okay, so the next step is I'm going to sew that seam all the way along the back off the end, and then I'm going to press the seam allowances open. So now the back has been sewn and the seam allowances are pressed apart. So now I have it on the wrong side facing up. So get your zipper. You want to place your zipper right side down so the pull is facing down. If you do it the wrong side, you can still wear this, but I can tell you right now, it's difficult to get into by yourself. And then the bottom stopper, you want to align with the notch. So the notch is just above the hip here. And you want to place it so that the zipper teeth are precisely in the middle of the sewn seam. So that's what the crucial thing is. So I'm going to keep on checking that it is central and pinning. Okay, and if your zipper goes off the top, that is not a problem at all. It does not matter. Theoretically, there's ever so slightly different lengths of zippers required per size, but there's really no point in worrying about that. Just get it at least 24 and you'll be fine. So now I am going to sew through the zipper tape and through the pressed over seam allowance and the front. So the stitching is going to show on the front. And I'm going to sew, it does not matter exactly where you sew this. So unlike usual patterns where it matters a lot, on this, because of the way that it's constructed, it doesn't matter so much. So we're going to sew down this side of the tape, all the way down to the bottom, across just underneath the stopper, and then up the whole other side. So I'm going to do that now. So this zipper is now sewn in, which is going to be clearer to see from the right side. So as you can see, the red stitching down and across up here. So now what we're going to do is unpick the basting stitch all the way along here so that we can open the zip. So I am just going to do this way of using a seam ripper, which is not the way I usually do, but with basting and with a sloper, where it doesn't matter if I ever so slightly catch the fabric. You know what, I'm going to do the other way, so it's easier. Works pretty well. There we go. So, moment of truth, let's see if we can unzip it. Boom, very nice. So, we now have a functioning zipper. We don't need to worry about the top coming off. I actually recommend not doing anything about this. You don't want to lose the stopper. And when you try it on, you can just fold the zip down either way. It's fine. If you really, really can't stand that, then what I would do is take it down to here. Then you need to sew on each side a stopper and be really, really clear that the thread is over it. So you can use a hand needle and go over to make a new stopper and stop it there. But I don't bother. Okay, so the next step is to sew the shoulder seams and the side seams. So my back is facing right side up. I'm going to take my front and put it right side down. And then this is very much like you'll be used to if you've ever sewn a dress or a top ever. We're just going to pin across the shoulders. Like that. And then we're going to pin down the side seams. The order of construction is a little bit different than usual Cashmerette patterns. I already mentioned that one big reason for that is so that we can adjust things a little bit more easily. So for instance, in Cashmerette patterns, we very often will sew the sleeves in using the flat method. It is much faster for most people. It's easy to be accurate. But in this case, we're not. We're going to put the sleeves in the round. And the reason is it is much easier to alter sleeves that have been inserted in the round. You can rip them out much more easily and put them in. You can rotate them, things like that. So we have made the instructions for the Wyman Sloper very deliberately a bit different than our usual ones. So I've pinned the shoulders and one side seam. I'm going to pin the other side seam, and then we're simply going to sew across both shoulders and sew down both side seams. We are going to press the shoulders open and the side seams towards the back. Okay, so the main body of our dress is now done. Next, putting the sleeves in. So there are two different sleeves, and I'm going to show you how to make both of them. I do recommend, for the purpose of making your sloper, ideally you put the same sleeve in. And the reason I say that is because a lot of people have asymmetry. So it's a really good idea to see like two one-piece sleeves or two two-piece sleeves. Yes, if your arms are extremely symmetrical and you know that already, you can do one of each and then compare and see which one you like more. But if there's any asymmetry in your shoulders or in your arms, I would recommend using the same one so that you can actually evaluate it. So let's begin with the two-piece sleeve. We have the outer sleeve and the inner sleeve. And what we need to do is connect them at the side seams of the sleeve. So I'm just going to flip this over, and you can match the notches if you're not sure. So this is the front of the sleeve. Generally, a single notch means front. I'm lining them up, making sure I'm actually mostly looking at this notch because this is the sew line notch. And one of the nice things about two-piece sleeves is that our arms are curved, so they do not hang totally straight down from your arm socket. We have an elbow. They are more to the front of our body and they curve, and two-piece sleeves really allow for that curve, which is one of the reasons why people often get a superior fit in them. The other benefit of two-piece sleeves, as I mentioned earlier, is that if you have bigger arms, it gives you a lot of places to play with, because you can change the shape of two seams here rather than just one. So it can be a really nice way to get more shaping. So I have now pinned this front seam. So you want to sew all the way to the top as before. So if you need the help, you can just draw that on there so that you see where you're going. And you are going to, when you sew this, you are going to press it towards the inner sleeve. So the front is going to be going this way, and then the back one is actually going to be going in the same direction, but towards the back. So they're both going this way. So now I'm going to pull this over here. In the instructions, this is 2 steps, but in reality, as you can see, you can easily do it in one. Again, I'm always checking that the sew lines are matching up. If you want to pin along the sew lines, you can. I prefer pinning at a right angle myself. And then up here, again, it should all line up. So we have trued the seam allowance here so that it should all line up at this point. Okay, so now I'm going to sew down both of these seams from the top all the way to the bottom. And again, here, we're going to extend up to the edge of the seam allowance all the way down to the bottom. So this is the one-piece sleeve. So the one-piece sleeve has an elbow dart. I've gone ahead, sewn that, and pressed it down. And now we are again going to make it into a sleeve shape by bringing the side seams together. So the one-piece sleeve is more basic than the two-piece sleeve, but it's also much more common in patterns. So if you are developing your sloper primarily with the objective to use it to fit other patterns, it is a good idea to have fit the one-piece sleeve. Obviously, you can do both. You can create a two-piece and a one-piece sleeve, which would be ideal. If you only choose one and you don't think you're going to need major arm changes, then I would probably pick the one-piece sleeve because it will be more useful for you in the long term. Okay, so now I'm going to sew the seam from the top to the bottom. Then I'm going to press the seam allowance towards the front, which helps us avoid bulk at the underarm because the side seam is pressed towards the back. Okay, so both sleeves have now been sewn. So a couple of extra things to note. So here's the one-piece sleeve. We have pressed under the hem by 1 inch. You don't sew this. This is just to give you a sense when you try your sloper on of where the hem is intended to be. And then obviously it gives you a little bit of wiggle room to adjust it to where you want it to be. So same on both. And then added gathering stitches. So to be honest, you're using a basting stitch anyway, so it's the same amount around the sleeve caps of both. And you want to leave long thread tails as well. Now, there actually isn't very much ease at all, if any, in the sleeve cap of this pattern. But because there's these big 1-inch seam allowances, you need to be able to control those. So that's where the basting really helps. So we don't need to reduce the stitching line. We just need to reduce the seam allowance to get them in there. So the next thing we're going to do is insert the sleeves. Okay, so I have my main dress and it's wrong side out, so inside out. And I have my sleeve, which is right sides out. Now, every single time I insert a sleeve, I almost have to think about it from scratch. But what is helpful is just to place it there and be like, okay, does this make sense? So I know that I need to match the double notches and the single notches. And this is going to go in here. So you can see that the double notches will match up. So before I do that, I'm going to gently pull on the gathering stitches. Hold on, I'm going to do it one at a time. To basically gather up the seam allowance. You ultimately won't need that much gathering, but it's better to do a little bit too much now and then you can let it out. So I'm pulling on one and now the other. Be careful that it doesn't pull out from the other end. That's why having a long thread tail is important. So we don't actually want the stitching line to be gathered. That should be flat, but we want to control this seam allowance. And you can see that it almost is already creating the shape of a sleeve, which is what we want. So now this is the one-piece sleeve. I'll show you the two-piece in a minute. So now I'm going to put the sleeve into the armhole. And they are right sides together. So the right side of the dress is hitting the right side of the sleeve. Okay. And now I'm going to pin them at the key points. So the underarm matches on the one-piece sleeve, the side seam of the sleeve. So I'm going to match those up there. And the side seam of the dress is pressed towards the back. The side seam of the sleeve is pressed towards the front. There we go. Now I'm going to find the notch at the top of the sleeve here, and I'm going to match it up with the shoulder seam, which should be pressed open. There we go. So now I'm going to match these up. So the notch here on the sew line is matching the junction here. And I recommend not pinning too tightly through the gathering stitches so that you're giving yourself the leeway. Okay, so we now have it anchored at the top and the bottom. So now I'm going to pin it at the double notches at the back. And here, the two fabrics are going to be totally flat against each other. Then I'm going to do the same on the front. And it's the same thing. We didn't do any gathering in this first section, so they are easy to pin together. I will say this is the part of the sewing where the 1-inch seam allowance is the most tricky, but it's doable. We checked it. So now I'm going to turn it around a little bit to make it easier. And I just want to make sure that the sew lines are totally flat. So in my case, there's a bit too much gathering here. So I'm just easing it out by just pulling it apart. Okay, and I'm gonna pin these together. Again, I'm looking through the fabric to make sure the sew lines are in the right place. So in the end, you can see there's only a little bit of gathering here. It's not tons. And now I'm going to do the same for the other side. So again, it's a bit too gathered. Get those lines matched up. Okay, that is ready for sewing in all the way around. Now for the two-piece sleeve, fundamentally it's the same, but the difference is that you don't have an underarm seam because it's a two-piece, so it doesn't have that. I'm just gonna pull the gathering, start a little bit. So instead of having an underarm seam, it's this notch. So this notch correlates with the side seam of the dress, and there's the front single notch and there's the double back notch. So I'm just going to pin it in exactly the same way. Shoulder notch, underarm, front and back. Okay, so the sleeves are inserted. As I already mentioned, I pressed the hems up by 1 inch. I also pressed the skirt hem up by 1 inch. Again, it typically stays in place, but if you want, you can put a few safety pins in to keep it from falling down. And so the final thing we're going to do is snip into the neckline. The reason we do this is because when you're trying on your muslin, you want to have the sew line as the outer point, because that's where, when you make a garment, that's where it's going to be. So if you snip into it, it makes it easier to fold it in and down. So I'm just going to show you. Just every inch or so, you want to go up to, but not through, the stitching. I'm going to turn it so it's a little bit easier for me to do. If you do accidentally go through it, you can just re-sew over the line. Unlike with a normal garment, if you just did it on a sloper, it doesn't really matter. Okay. So the final step is simply to press those to the wrong side so that you have a nice neckline. And that is it.